Thank you, David. Good morning. The Lord be with you. I grew up Episcopal, and I love that little spiritual dog leash that we have as Episcopalians. So thank you for being here this morning, and thank you guys for having us. Hopefully this will be helpful to you. We like to kind of do it informally, so we've got a presentation here. The handouts on your table should match this, and thanks to Rhonda for putting that together. She spent a chunk of her Saturday yesterday putting this together for us. If you like it, thank her. If you don't like it, it's all about forgiveness, right? So if you have any suggestions to make it better, let us know. So let's jump right in. So the reason why we do this is to help people understand the options that are available to you, at least specifically with regard to Medicaid. We'll touch a little bit on VA benefits. There are some VA benefits that can help. But basically what we want folks to know is what's available out there to help our seniors pay for long-term care. The statistics are kind of bleak. They show that 70% of the elder folks out there don't have sufficient resources on their own to pay for long-term care. They don't have a long-term care insurance policy, and so what happens? They need help. So a typical situation that we face, and I think about to be facing this, my parents are 80 and are aging as well. You run into this scenario. Dad has a stroke. Dad goes into the hospital. Dad then discharges into a rehab facility, and he's there for a while. And the realization that mom has is, oh my goodness, how are we going to pay for this? He's going to have to be there either in a rehab or a long-term skilled nursing facility for a substantial period of time, maybe for the rest of his life. How do we pay for this? So what do? We start talking to our friends and our neighbors and our coworkers, and we start getting information about how Medicaid works, because Medicaid quickly becomes, as you Google it, that's something that we can utilize to help pay for long-term care. So we start Googling it. We talk to friends and coworkers, etc. And what do we find out? Well, the first thing that we hear is, oh my gosh, if you get on Medicaid, they're going to take your house. They're going to take my house. What do I do? Or I've got to spend all of my mom's and dad's assets before I can get dad on Medicaid. Or you hear, well, they make too much money. They can't get on Medicaid. Or another one that you hear is, well, they have way too many assets. They'll never qualify. They've got to spend all their assets before they can go into a facility. Or let's say you've got assets and you've heard from somebody that you can transfer assets, but then you hear that you can't do that because you're going to get penalized for 5 years. Some people mistakenly think that, okay, I've got health insurance, right? That covers long-term care. Wrong. It doesn't. Or I have long-term care insurance, so I don't need Medicaid. Now, there's a grain of truth to that one, because long-term care insurance can help pay for things, and hopefully it will pay for everything. But if it doesn't, Medicaid can be a good supplementary resource. Or I have Medicare, so I don't need Medicaid. Wrong. We'll talk about why that's the case. Or I can only get Medicaid if I'm in a nursing home. No. So there's lots of myths and misconceptions out there about how Medicaid works and what it can do and what it can't do. And that's why we're here today, is to talk about that and give you some good news, okay? The good news is it is possible to get Medicaid benefits without going broke, without losing your home, and without waiting for this mythical five-year look-back period that everybody hears about. The reality is, if you get proper tools in place, you can achieve Medicaid eligibility while preserving the assets of your loved ones so that they last as long as possible for their care. We'll talk about specifically how to do that. So what I would encourage you to do as you think about these things, as you talk to people who are dealing with these issues, never assume that income is too high, that resources are too high, or that there's no way that you can get help. There are very limited circumstances where an elder lawyer who's familiar with Medicaid can't help. So let's talk a little bit about how that can be the case. If your income is above the limit, we can fix that problem using what we call a Miller Trust or a qualified income trust. We'll talk more about that. Health insurance and Medicare are only temporary measures to help. They can help while you're in your first 100 days. If you're familiar with Medicaid, Medicare, once you go into a facility, Medicare is available for the first 100 days, even in a long-term care environment. But after day 100, you're kind of on your own if Medicare drops out. And Medicare can drop out sooner than that, so that can become an issue quicker than you think it is. It only covers temporarily the rehab expenses. Long-term care insurance can be helpful. Now, the problem with long-term care insurance is a lot of our seniors these days don't have it. If you haven't gotten it by the time you're my age, I'm pushing 60, it becomes more and more difficult to get. It's the eligibility, the underwriting criteria is difficult, and it's ridiculously expensive. There are some new products coming out called hybrid products. So it is kind of a life insurance policy with a health care component to it or a long-term care component to it. Those are out there, but by and large, long-term care insurance is really not these days a great option, especially if you don't already have it. So there's different types of Medicaid, and in fact, Medicaid is a federal program administered by each state, and so each state kind of has their own setup of how their Medicaid programs work. In Texas, I would say not unlike many states, Texas has a patchwork of programs. There's a flavor of Medicaid that deals with lots of different situations. The most common one that we deal with is what we call nursing home Medicaid or MEPD Medicaid. That's the Medicaid that covers you when you go into a skilled nursing facility. There are other types of programs, what we call community-based Medicaid. Those things cover assisted living, group home, and in your own home. So if you want to age in place, if you have the ability to do that, Medicaid does have some programs, community-based programs, that can have people come into the home and help you. The problem with the community-based programs is they're a little bit difficult to get into. For example, in assisted living facilities, there is a flavor called Star Plus Medicaid. It's a good benefit, but the problem is there's a waiting list anywhere from 12 to 18 months. So when you get to that situation where you're like, oh my gosh, how are we going to pay for this? If you're in an assisted living environment, it can be difficult because you've got that ramp-up window of the interest list. So if we move on to the next slide. Yes, sir.
Is the waiting list because there's so many boomers going in its capacity, or is it going to diminish over time?
It's a combination of problems. So the demand is high. The number of facilities that qualify for the Star Plus program are low, and so you've got a supply-demand disconnect. And also, COVID had a big impact on that. We were able to push people through 3 to 4 months on that Star Plus list for a long time, and then COVID hit, and then everything stopped. And now we're still trying to unwind that problem. So good question. There are things called Medicare savings programs. We don't deal with these a lot, but basically understand that there are Medicaid programs that are really Medicare savings programs. There's QMB, there's SLMB, lots of acronyms. Basically what it is it's a program through Medicaid that helps seniors pay for their Medicare costs. So most of us probably when we get to that age will have Part A, Part B coverage on Medicare. There are programs that once you go into a nursing home facility, for example, if you qualify for the QMB program, that can help you pay for your Medicare costs, the $170 a month or whatever it is for your Part B program. So let's start talking about the basics of Medicaid eligibility. What does it take to qualify for Medicaid? So there's some non-financial criteria. We'll touch on those briefly because these usually aren't a problem. The first is you have to be a United States citizen or you have to have a green card. If you're not a United States citizen, you can qualify with a green card. You have to have some sort of disability. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But primarily what you have in a non-financial scenario is you have medical necessity. You have to have a medically necessary reason to be where you're going to be. And it's important to note that unless it's a community-based program, you actually have to be in the facility in order to apply for and qualify for Medicaid. So, of course, you have to have medical necessity for a nursing home example. You have to have medical necessity for skilled nursing services to qualify for Medicaid. So then we look at the financial criteria, and let me back up one step. The medical necessity component is really not something that we deal a lot with and probably that you won't deal a lot with. It's one of those things you either have it or you don't. It's based on your medical condition, your medications. They look at your medical records to make the determination initially whether you're eligible from a necessity standpoint. So we really don't deal a lot with that. But what we do deal a lot with is the financial eligibility. This is the big piece. So they look at two things. They look at your income and they look at your resources, what normal people call assets, right? So they look at those two things. Let's focus on each one a little bit. So the first is they look at your income. Now, it's important to remember that they only look at the applicant's income. So if you have a spousal situation and dad needs to go in the nursing home, they're only going to look at dad's income, not mom and dad's income. So they look at anything that is income or that they can characterize as income. So they're looking at paychecks, employment, Social Security, pension, royalties, some annuities will count. Rental income, they'll look at if you've got a retirement account, 401k, IRA, and it's spinning off RMDs, required minimum distributions. If you're over 72 and a half, you have to take required minimum distributions. Those count as income. They look at the value of food and shelter in certain circumstances, or the value of goods and services that you're receiving. So if you're getting those two components, you'd really need to check with someone that can help you understand whether those are going to be income counting issues. So then the other thing they look at are resources, or like I said, what we normally think of as assets. Now, resources are things that have cash value, like money in a bank account, the surrender value of an annuity, a life insurance policy, those kinds of things. So basically what Medicaid does is they look at an asset and they say, can that be readily converted to cash to allow that senior to pay for their care? If it can be, with certain exceptions, then it's going to be what we call a countable resource, meaning that it counts against you for eligibility. So think about things that you could sell, surrender for cash. Those are the kinds of things that they're going to look at, and it's the fair market value of that item. So for example, if you've got a piece of real estate that's got a vacation home on it in Northeast Texas, out by Lake Tawakoni, whatever it is, if you could sell that asset and convert it to cash readily, they're going to count that. So there are some assets that what we call excluded assets. So what that means is the value of that resource is not countable when determining Medicaid. So what they do is they put it in two buckets. They look at, is it excluded or is it countable? So if it's excluded, it doesn't count against your eligibility criteria. But if it's a countable resource, it does. And so it's important to understand the differentiation between what's excluded and what's countable. So examples of excluded resources, the big one is a homestead. If you have a homestead and you're living in that homestead when you go into the facility or the spouse goes into the facility, the entire equity value up to right now about $600,000 is a non-countable excluded resource, which is huge, right? So many of us save our money by putting equity into our homes. My folks are in that same camp. A big chunk of their net worth, their assets that would otherwise be countable assets are excluded because it's the equity that they have in their house. Now, it has to be your homestead. You can exclude one automobile. Doesn't really matter how much it's worth, although if you have a Medicaid caseworker and they see you've got a Maserati as your one vehicle, they may raise an eyebrow about that. But technically, there is no limit on the value. If you have prepaid funeral or cremation products or plans, those are excluded resources. Now, the catch with that is they have to be irrevocable, meaning that you can't change your mind and get your money back for what you've already paid for. If it's irrevocable, it's non-countable. And the way they typically do that is they'll take the value of what you purchase and they'll put it into a single premium insurance policy that's payable to the facility. Usually in those kinds of arrangements, it's excluded because it's an irrevocable contract. You can't unwind it. And then also burial plots. So if you have a burial space for your funeral, that's excluded. So I'm going to turn it over to Rhonda at this point to go through some specifics with you, some facts of what's in and what's out, and some examples of how all this stuff works. Take it away.
Basically with, Medicaid is going to put everything into two piles, income and assets. And the terminology you're going to see in this handout, the applicant, of course, is the person in the nursing home, for example, applying for benefits. You may see a reference to community spouse. So in the case of a married couple where one's in the nursing home, the other one's at home, the one at home is referred to as a community spouse. That top number, the applicant's income cap is $2,742. Now these numbers do change over time. Once every couple of years, typically you'll see some changes here. So Medicaid is using the gross income number. And like Jeff said earlier, if someone's income is above this 2742, that problem is solvable with that qualified income trust or Miller trust. The next item you see there, personal needs allowance of $60. If I'm in a nursing home and I'm on Medicaid, the way that they calculate my financial responsibility, and they will call it a copay or applied income. If my income was just $1,000 Social Security, Medicaid lets me keep $60 pocket money in case I need a haircut, if it'll cover it even. And the $940, for example, goes to the facility as a copayment. They do let me pay my health insurance. So if I had $1,000 and I had a $100 health insurance payment, that knocks it down to $900 minus 60, now $840 goes to the nursing home. So that's how that copay calculation works. Resource allowance, the word resource is interchangeable with assets. So cash value of the bank account, checking, savings, CDs, savings bonds, cash value of life insurance, those kinds of things. And when we apply for Medicaid, those are going to be for that applicant below $2,000. The next item there, couples, if you have a married couple and both of them are going into the nursing home at the same time, then their combined assets are going to be below $3,000 at the time that we apply. That does happen occasionally. It's pretty rare, thankfully. Monthly maintenance needs allowance. Whenever you have married applicants for Medicaid or single, the rules are a little bit different. Married cases are a bit more complex, but luckily they're more advantageous in a lot of ways. There are a lot of rules that help spouses, so the spouse at home is not impoverished. So these next few are related to that. This monthly maintenance needs allowance, let's talk about. Think about what I just said about copay. If I'm always going to pick on you guys, and I apologize for that. So say the husband goes into the nursing home, and maybe his income was $3,000 a month. And what if his wife had a lower Social Security, maybe just $1,000? Her first thought, if he's going in the nursing home and she's thinking, oh my goodness, all of his income is going to go to the facility, she's terrified because she still has the same house, the same bills she's got to eat, right? So this maintenance needs allowance is basically a great rule to keep that wife from becoming impoverished in this example. So basically when her income is below that $3,715, she's going to be authorized or able to keep some of that husband's income and give less of a copay to the nursing home. So it's a fantastic rule. On the flip side, let's say the husband is going into the nursing home and the wife's income is really high, like $10,000 a month. Hers is never subject to his copay. So at the maximum, the person in the nursing home, all of their income might go toward the copay, but never does the spouse's income have to go to that facility, okay? The next two rules, those community spouse resource allowances, there's a minimum and a maximum. Basically what's happening with this rule is, let's say the husband in this example is at home on October 10th and he has a stroke or something and goes into the hospital. Medicaid is going to take a snapshot of that couple's assets on October 1st. Beginning of that month, one of them went into facilities. And let's just pretend they had $200,000 in the bank, they had a house, and that was it. When we apply for Medicaid, it might be December 1st. So what's happening is Medicaid's going to compare that snapshot October 1st to what we've got when we go apply on December 1st, for example. So I use $200,000 to make the math simple. If we had $200,000 before, Medicaid divides by 2 and says that wife at home can keep half, which is $100,000 on December 1st. And your next question is probably, well, what on earth do we do with the husband's half? That's where we come in. We basically can help that wife end up preserving all of those assets at the end of the story. But at the time we apply, what's happening with this rule is Medicaid is saying the spouse at home can keep half of those assets as long as half fits within that 29 to 148 range, just at that moment in time. If a couple, if their half is beyond the range, it's still a fixable problem. What's really interesting with the rules and how they're written is married couples, when one of them is going into a facility applying for Medicaid, by applying those rules, you can come out of it preserving everything for that spouse at home, so they're not going to lose their house. They'll be able to stay in it and pay the taxes and all those kinds of things. Now, the very last one is a divestment penalty divisor. What that means is if we give away assets, like to our children, anybody besides our spouse, Medicaid is going to penalize us. So that 5-year look back period everyone hears about. Most of the time when people come in and they're asking questions about this, they think, hey, if I gave away something, I can't do anything for 5 years. And that's not really how it's applied. So basically, if I gave, say, $70,000 to my sister 2 years ago and I'm asking for Medicaid today in a nursing home, Medicaid's going to take $70,000, divide it by that monthly number you see there, $73.39, and they're going to say, okay, we'll put you on Medicaid, but you've got to pay that nursing home for 10 months. That's how the penalty period works. So it's based upon how much you gave away that was penalizable within that 5-year time frame, and you're just going to have to private pay for the specified amount of time based on that. Okay. Well, what's actually interesting is if I gave away $1 million 6 years ago, we're not talking about it when I apply. But if I'm applying within 5 years from the time I made the gift, that penalty starts when I'm eligible. So it's when I go in the nursing home. So it's not like I can give away 70, wait 10 months. When I apply, that's when my penalty starts. But it's, the really difficult cases when this kind of, it's just flat out, how much you gave away, and that penalty starts clicking when you're otherwise eligible. So in this example, if I apply for Medicaid December 1st and I have a 10-month penalty, that 10 months starts December 1st, regardless of when I made the gift within the prior 5 years.
Because I think a lot of people think that.
They do.
Yeah.
These rules have changed over time. So, over the past 20 years, it used to be a 3-year look-back period. The way they assessed the penalties was at the time of the gift. And they tweak the rules occasionally because they're tightening it up. It's a really expensive program. But there's a couple of different types of planning. Pre-planning and crisis. What I just described as a crisis. Somebody's got a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. Somebody has a bad fall and ends up in rehab. Stroke, those kinds of heavy, health crises usually is what forces us into this world. When I go to the hospital for a few days, 3 or more, and then the hospital sends me to rehab and skilled care, that 3-day hospital stay is what triggers Medicare to temporarily cover rehab. So Jeff kind of alluded to that. The first 20 days Medicare covers completely. When you hit day 21 through up to 100, the copay this year is $200 a day for therapy. So if you don't have supplemental health insurance policies that help pick up some of that lapse there, it's pretty expensive just to get therapy. It always feels incredibly abrupt. You're at the nursing home or your spouse is, and somebody strolls into the room and says, guess what, Medicare's done. It's not like they're going to say it's done in 2 weeks. It's just like, you're off, get off the bus, You can appeal it and stretch that out a little bit, but that's the scary part about this thing is nobody's telling you this on day one, right? So crisis is basically there's something going on now and we have to fix it now. Pre-planning is basically when we're all healthy, or perhaps we're betting that we have a really healthy 5 years in front of us. I can kind of tell you the things that can happen in a crisis scenario for a single person who's applying or a married person who's applying. Pre-planning, you might vary on when you think that's a great idea. Say you have a big family farm in Kansas, you never want to have to sell. Maybe your heirs are going to depend on that for income. Maybe that's the kind of thing that would trigger you to do some pre-planning. All right, so I kind of jumped ahead and talked about this a little bit, but the first 20 days Medicare covers. When you hit day 21, you have that high coinsurance. Any of these numbers you see in the slides will change over time. So next year, the cost of Medicare and these numbers will be a little bit different. I'm going to give you just a couple of planning examples just so you can see. I don't expect you to absorb how this is really done. I just want you to see kind of what can be done for different people. So Mary is 82, had a fall, broke her hip. She's in the hospital for 1 week. So because she's there for 3 or more days, she is going to get some Medicare-covered rehab when she departs the hospital and goes to the facility. Next. So once she's at the nursing home, she's having to stay here. So this is just a good example of kind of what she had at the time she went in. So her income, you'll notice, is below the limit. She's got a house, checking, savings, CDs, life insurance, and a car. So let's kind of put this together a little bit. Back up. Back up one slide. Sorry. All right. So her income is low enough. Her house, remember, is excluded. I think this year the house limit's about $688. And then life insurance is going to count, her car is an excluded asset. So really in a planning context, we're mostly worried about these cash value assets, okay? The result for her is you can save the homestead or the car, both of them actually. If she buys that prepaid funeral and makes it irrevocable, that's going to be excluded as well. And out of those items that, we said were countable, she's able to preserve 65% of those. Now, when I'm talking about preserving assets, I'm not really concerned about somebody inheriting those assets. But if you look at this woman, she's got a house and the taxes have to be paid. If she's on Medicaid and she's only got $60, I don't know who all goes and pays for haircuts. Think about how much it costs, right? So it just doesn't go very far. They don't give her an allowance to go buy clothes or anything like that, And for the most part, their needs are going to be met, but you still have some other needs. So when we set aside something like this, now the family has a little bit set aside to help supplement her care, buy her the clothes, take care of the house so it's not lost. And the goal here is really to make what a person has last as long as possible for their care. If you think about, sometimes we say, if someone's going in the nursing home, maybe they're not going to come back out, or that may be a common assumption. But I've had cases where, say I've got a 60-year-old with a crazy health event, goes into a nursing home entirely out of her mind. We think this lady's not going to survive, let alone get better. And sure enough, she gets better and she's able to leave the nursing home. What if we took her house away in the meantime? She's not going to have the income or resources to be able to get back to what she had. So it's really important to preserve those kind of things. One more issue about the house. Just because a house is excluded, it doesn't necessarily mean it's entirely safe. If I've been on Medicaid and I pass away and my house ends up in my probate estate, Texas can show back up in probate like a creditor and say, here's the bill for that nursing home, pay me back out of the house. That's also a very terrifying event for spouses, or what if you've got a disabled child or somebody that needs that house to live in when you're gone. So some of the planning that's done with respect to deeds, we'll mention a little bit later, keeps that house safe from those kinds of issues. Okay?
Quick question.
Yes, sir.
How does that threshold, 600,000, how's that determined? Is it a appraisal?
It's we get to use the tax appraised number, which in reality is usually lower than true market, right? An interesting thing about houses, there are exceptions to that rule. So if you think about right now, some houses, they've shot up in value, right? And it's, years ago it was unheard of when we're sitting around doing Medicaid applications to have people with these, high value houses, and now it's a lot more common. So it is even possible to have a house beyond that threshold under certain circumstances and not lose it. But they do let us use like the Dallas County tax appraisal thing, for example. Henry's also single, 76, stroke, hospital. So again, we're going to have those rehab days, and now he goes to the nursing home. Excuse me, and the doctors are saying he can't go back home. Take a quick look at his. His income is high, right? So we're going to do that income trust to fix it. House, some similar kind of assets here, car and prepaid funeral. His is not irrevocable. What's really cool, even if he already has one, it's really easy to make it irrevocable at the time. You sign a paper, the funeral home signs a paper, and that's all it takes. So it's a really easy fix. Next slide. Oh. All right, so the result for him, you might notice his percentage is higher. So very similar circumstances. What's happening with this kind of thing is, if my income is this high and my nursing home is this high, that gap is kind of driving a person's percentage of asset preservation when they're doing some planning and applying for Medicaid. So if you think about it, if my income is 1,000 and my nursing home's 6, that's a huge gap. When my income is 3, I'm closing that gap, which kind of makes it easier for someone to come out of that a little bit better off with the finances.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
On the income cap,
Sure.
it's a binary thing, meaning it's not that when you reach that monthly income cap, it's not like benefits start to wear away or something. It goes to 0 unless you somehow preserve some of that income. You have to get back below the cap to become eligible.
This is going to sound totally silly, but a qualified income trust or Miller trust, when people hear the word trust, they think that's where I put my cash. No, it's strictly an income vehicle. So yes, there's a trust document, it's a couple pages long, nothing fancy. It's like a clearing account. So I do a trust and then I open, this is my bank account. And basically I put my income in it each month, pay my copay to the nursing home, and the bank account's like $0 to $50. That's it. That's all a QIT is. So as long as I'm funneling my income through there, then Medicaid lets me off the hook when my income is too high.
To draw an extreme example, $15,000 monthly income and push it all through this trust.
Sure.
To make it appear on paper, you have less than 2,700.
Yes, and the only hiccup you'll run into with a very large number is if your income is so much, because think about that copay scenario. If my income is way beyond my private pay, Medicaid's going to say you don't have a need, kind of. The other thing is sometimes you'll hear, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but sometimes if somebody has cash, you'll have some insurance salesman stroll in and go, hey, let's put all that into an annuity and change it to income. Horrible idea, because all your income goes to the facility, so that insurance salesman didn't really save the principal. You know, you don't have anything to supplement your care. It's all going to the nursing home. The other kicker is when someone dies and there's cash left in one of those, guess who gets it? Texas, not your spouse or well, spouse maybe, but not your kids or anybody else. So, I mean, there's interesting tricks, so to speak, but they follow the rules like we said earlier. But yeah, income trust are, really simple tool to use, but it gets you off the hook when your income's too high. I know it sounds crazy because if you think like nursing homes, let's talk about cost for a minute. Assisted living, if you're lucky, probably starts around $3,500 a month. And every little bit of service you need, like medicine and meals and cleaning, it's piling up. They either come in packages or it's an a la carte kind of thing. So if you've got somebody who's extremely physically disabled, like with MS, and they're in assisted living, they might be paying $10,000 a month. Nursing homes on the Tarrant County side of town are at least $5,000 usually. If you're in Dallas, Frisco, some of those are probably going to be, $7,500, $8,000 a month. Memory care, also more expensive than the average nursing home. You'll hear memory care tied to assisted living and nursing homes. So you got to kind of pay attention when you're picking programs to catch that. And when you find facilities that have Medicaid certifications or Medicaid beds, you'll hear us call it memory care, and the assisted or nursing that you're wanting, that's kind of the unicorn. Over the past 20 years, this community Medicaid for assisted living was just unheard of. They've made vast improvements to those kind of programs, so they're out there. Thankfully, there are more kind of coming on the horizon than there used to be. Let's take a peek at a married example just really quickly. Married couple, wife's going to be at home. Like I said, I always put you poor guys in the nursing home first. So Mark goes to rehab, and they're saying, hey, he can't go back home safely. All right, so their assets, see, here's a good example where his was the higher income and hers is low. So again, we don't want to make her homeless, so we're not going to have to give all of his away. House is modest and a few, cash value things here, and 2 cars. So the result of theirs is saving the house, both cars, 100% of everything they have for that lovely wife at home, and immediately get him on Medicaid. So you heard us say a car is excluded, 2 cars are not. So one we get to exclude. Luckily, they let us, exclude the Escalade and maybe only count the Toyota's value. I mean, it's nice the way they apply the rules. Next one. Okay.
Wait, how did you preserve both cars? Did I miss that?
No. Think about the total assets. Remember, some are excluded. So if I have, can you back up to that their asset list? I didn't. Oh yeah, I did. Listed a value for each of them. So if I get to exclude this one, this $6,000 then counts as part of what that wife can keep at home when I apply. So if I've got like a bunch of cash here in this car, and I say, remember this little range here I got to get her to fit in? I'll just take some more cash and maybe do some planning with that to preserve it for her, but she didn't necessarily have to sell the car.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just keep in mind that one car is excluded. It's off the table. The other car is on the table, but then you deal with the value of it. Yeah.
And a lot of times people will say, say if I've got $60,000 and that's all I have, I might go into a law office and say, should I buy an Escalade? And I always like, no. I mean, you can do
But
that.
I say yes because my son sells Escalade, so it's.
Oh, me. But, you know, there's so many different planning opportunities, sometimes that might be a great idea. But since they decline over time, then maybe I want to do something else so I have some cash for those haircuts, pedicures and all that, right? All right. Let me talk about long-term care insurance really quickly. He brought it up earlier. Long-term care insurance is great. It buys you more options. It often keeps people home longer, might keep you more independent longer. And, you know, assisted living is more of an independent kind of lifestyle than a nursing home is, right? So never think that these are bad at all. If you have them, they're great. I know they are very expensive, and sometimes that gets worse over time, but they're terrific. So think about earlier when I was talking about the 2 single cases and they came out with different percentage of savings. You know, having long-term care insurance in a planning context is really like having more income. You know, it might buy you time to get through penalty periods if you've given something away. But basically, it's closing that gap. So somebody doing Medicaid planning with long-term care might come out of it as a single person saving everything for themselves. So don't write them off. They're really great. Next. All right, some planning tools, and I've been saying some of this, and Jeff has as we're going through. Qualified income trust is at Miller Trust. Do you remember why the heck they call it Miller Trust?
I do not.
I don't either. But it's just a nickname, and just remember, it's an income tool. It has nothing to do with someone's assets. Annuities. Annuities can be the devil. Sometimes I say annuities and half the room goes, you know, because they've had a bad experience or they know someone that has. So annuities have some fantastic qualities in terms of Medicaid planning. So sometimes if a person has too much cash, we need to get off the table. Sometimes an immediate annuity takes an asset and changes it to income. Now, you heard me say earlier a reference about insurance salesmen wanting to put everything in annuities. You ever hear that, just run. They do have their uses, but usually to the minimum extent necessary, because in a Medicaid planning world, we don't want to use them to lock up a money for a long time. I don't want that money in danger of it going to Texas later instead of, you know, to your family or something like
Well,
that.
and let me just say something real quick about annuities. They're not all made the same in the Medicaid world. A normal annuity that you think of is probably not the kind of annuity that we would use in Medicaid planning because they have to have specific characteristics in order to be an excluded resource. So you can't just go get them from any, you know, annuity salesperson out there. There are, you know, a very few underwriters that actually market those products. Melody, what's your hard stop? I want to be respectful of your time.
10:15.
Perfect.
All right. I'm almost
I
done.
have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm always confused with Medicare, Medicaid, and beds in an assisted.
Okay.
Do they all take?
No. Think of Medicare like health insurance, and when you hit a nursing home, that's long-term, and that health insurance is it doesn't go away because it still covers health stuff, but Medicaid, think of that as what we're gonna have pay for the long haul. Medicaid beds, that's kind of a layman's term technically. Any kind of facility, whether assisted or nursing, as long as they're certified to accept Medicaid patients, that's all that means.
So when searching for
Yeah, and
assisted living, we want to look for those.
yes, and nursing homes, if you get on the internet and, you know, Google nursing home Medicaid, they're everywhere. The assisted living, they're out there, but they're not really advertised. So not as easy to find. You basically need to call a bunch of them and say, do you accept Medicaid? Because they don't show up on the internet the same way. But they're out there. One of the other things, deeds. When I talked about preserving houses, there's a couple different kind of deeds, and if I describe them, they're going to sound the same. You'll hear ladybird deed, enhanced life estate deed, transfer on death deed. Basically, what's happening with those deeds is if I sign one, I could say, when I die, because I like Jeff so much, he can have my house, right? He doesn't get it until I die. While I'm living, it's still mine, so I've not made a transfer. I can revoke it if he ticks me off. I can change it, give it to somebody else I like better. But what's really cool or magical about the right kind of deed is that it's going to pass, keep the house out of probate, keeps it safe from that Medicaid recovery, and it doesn't tick off Medicaid. Spin down. I hate that term. You hear it a lot in the Medicaid planning world because it sounds like we're just spinning down and getting rid of a bunch of assets. But in reality, it's meant to kind of cover some of the things we do in a planning context to make someone eligible just so we can get on Medicaid. So never think you have to go broke and just spend everything. Purchase of excluded assets like a house, the Escalade, prepaid funeral, sometimes that's a good thing to do with someone's cash, especially if you have a single person about to go into a nursing home. Because once the money's gone, it's gone. Buying a funeral is a fantastic idea usually. Next. Okay. The things that people do to get themselves into trouble. Basically, the do-it-yourself approach, can be kind of a field of landmines. Estate planning, Jeff's about to talk about. If your estate planning is not Medicaid friendly, and a lot of them are not because they don't have particular powers we want, when you deal with someone that just does estate planning versus elder law, that's where you're going to find the right tools in your estate plan. Not doing planning at all is bad. If you don't have a financial power of attorney and you lose your capacity, now your family's kind of stuck with guardianship through the court system, and the courts may not let you do some of the things that we're talking about. Kind of doing the wrong deeds or going off assumptions, playing by old rules. So things change over time. Next slide, one of which is the IRA. Years ago, IRAs were totally accountable assets. So it kind of put you in the position of cashing it all in, paying a bunch of tax just to kind of get where you need to be. They do have some new rules. They're not formalized in the regs just yet, so they could change. But when we're old enough to where Uncle Sam is making us take our RMDs, our required minimum distributions, they'll let us exclude that account value, but our income may still be a problem. So IRAs are really interesting. Anytime you have an asset that may be considered excluded, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do some planning with it. So go back to our married cases. I might want to do something with that IRA of the spouse going in so I can protect more of the income from it for that spouse at home. Really interesting rules they have that we can deal with those. So community Medicaid, just to come back and kind of tie these things together. Years ago, community Medicaid, it just never happened. The wait list was so long, everyone died before you hit the front of the line. Before COVID, it was about a 3-month wait on the wait list. They froze it. Sometimes it's 12 to 18, sometimes it's a 6-month wait. So if you're never in a nursing home, we get on the wait list. When we hit the front of the line, they let us apply. In the community program, you cannot have penalties for 5 years. So everything I said, I've been talking about nursing homes. You can take penalties and immediately apply and get on Medicaid. Assisted living, you can't. So what's really interesting is if you happen to be in a rehab facility and we do the nursing home Medicaid first, get on Medicaid, and then ask Medicaid to move us to assisted living, we can get those benefits to follow the person. So we skip the wait list, take care of the planning. We didn't have to go broke. We tackled that 5-year problem. I just kind of said all this really fast. All right, so other ways to kind of take care of that. If we have a lot of money where you can pay indefinitely, great. VA benefits, let's jump to that really fast just so I can, okay. These are in your slides, but VA aid and attendance, if this slide and the next one has dates. So if a person was on active duty, served in those dates, they didn't have to be boots on the ground in a conflict, they're over 65 and have some medical need, it's possible to get this kind of tax-free money from the VA to help cover care. And that care could be at home, assisted living, nursing, anything. The gist of how the VA looks at us, yes, there are income and asset tests, but let's assume the assets are fine for a minute. If my income is here and my medical costs, like the cost of my assisted living, is a little bit more, I'm going to get that max income from them. If my income is higher than my medical expenses, I might still get some, just not going to get the max. So hold on to that, because if you're a veteran or you know people that are, lots of people have no idea about these kind of programs, and it really it buys them a lot of options, keeps them at home longer, so it's fantastic. Next. Okay. This speaks for itself. If you don't take care of business ahead of time, it's not going to work out well for you. So I'm going to pass the torch back to Jeff to cover estate planning, because that's one of your number one things you can do to kind of plan ahead.
Okay, so just to kind of shift gears a little bit, because I mean, Medicaid's obviously important. It's important to understand the basics. The most important takeaway for me, for you, from me today, is to seek out help early on in the process, right? So as soon as you think you may have a need for it, or even if you're doing things in a planning stage with your loved ones, seek out someone who knows this area of the law and can help. Because there's lots of different things that we can do from an estate planning standpoint. But as Rhonda alluded to a little while ago, we have to look at these kinds of things through the lens of a Medicaid viewpoint, okay? So, for example, if we were going to do basic estate planning documents, these are the kinds of things that we would do. We would do a last will and testament. We would do a statutory durable power of attorney, the one that lets you take care of your loved one's finances. We would do a medical power of attorney, a HIPAA authorization so you can get the medical records that you need. A directive to physicians, a lot of people call this the living will. So this is the pull the plug document. If I'm a terminal irreversible condition, what do I want my physicians and my family to know about what I want done or not done? Declaration of guardians. So God forbid if you ever needed a guardianship, who do you want to be your guardian? Who do you not want to be your guardian? Ultimately, the court decides, and Ellen specializes in this area, so she knows how this works like we do. But if you ever needed a guardianship down the road, this is a document that gives you say-so to the court, who makes the ultimate decision, as to who you want your guardian to be or not to be. And then also agent for dispositions of remains. Now, when we're doing these basic documents, we're looking at them from the viewpoint of Medicaid, if we think that there's a possibility down the road that our loved one might want or need Medicaid. And usually what we're tweaking when we do that are two big documents, the financial power of attorney and the will, because there are special things that we need to do with both of those documents in a Medicaid scenario. The other thing that we can do as estate planners is trusts. Trusts can be a fantastic vehicle. And don't think of trusts as, I've got a lot of resources, so therefore I need a trust. I don't have a lot of resources, so therefore I don't. Trusts have a lot of benefit regardless of your situation. If all you have is a house, a trust can be helpful. If all you want to do is avoid probate, a trust can be a good way to do that. So there's lots of scenarios that will suggest that a trust is the right kind. But, as you might expect, all trusts are not made equal. There's all kinds of different trusts. There's what we call a living trust, where you create that during your lifetime. It allows you to make changes while you're alive, change it, terminate it, whatever you want to do. We can set up retirement trusts that are designed specifically to deal with retirement assets, 401ks, IRAs, those kinds of things. Irrevocable trusts we use in the Medicaid context. So let's say in Rhonda's discussion, we're putting this plan together to save the 60 to 75% of the assets for the stay-at-home spouse. One way to do that is to utilize a trust so that when you give away the assets as part of that plan, you're not giving them away to an individual that then goes to Vegas and spends all the money. You're instead putting it in a trust that's irrevocable. It can't be changed. It's Medicaid Asset Protection Trust is what we call it. So it can be a good Medicaid planning tool, but there's other kinds of irrevocable trusts out there. There's life insurance trusts and those kinds of things. One thing that we want to also consider is special needs planning. It's really important for us as estate planners to know your circumstances and your family. So if you are giving away assets to a loved one, I'll use my family. My brother is Down syndrome. My grandmother wanted to do some estate planning. She drafted a will to provide a benefit for my brother, who's one of her grandchildren, obviously. But she couldn't do that directly because that would have kicked him off his Medicaid. So what did we do? We had her estate planner draft a will that had a testamentary trust in it so that when her assets passed to my brother, they passed to him in a government benefit-friendly way. That's what we call special needs planning. I mentioned the Medicaid Asset Protection Trust. A different flavor of that is a Veterans Trust. We could talk more about that when we talk about VA, but it's a very similar concept. Now, pitfalls. What I was talking about with the Medicaid lens is the documents may not have the proper provisions that you want for long-term planning. So let's say, for example, mom and dad have an existing estate plan. They did it 15 years ago. Now they've gotten older, and we're looking at the possibility of Medicaid, but those documents that they did when they were younger may not have what we want them to have in order for us to maximize our chances to do Medicaid planning. So that's a scenario where we would want to redo those documents. I mentioned the guardianship angle. If you don't have the proper estate planning documents, that can be a recipe for a guardianship. Powers of attorney, a lot of people think those are the magic bullet, and they are very helpful. The problem with powers of attorney is they are an invitation to act, not a directive. So if you take your power of attorney to Bank of America and invite them to let you act under your power of attorney, they can say no. There's limitations to that, but there are limitations to what you can do with the power of attorney. So if we do the right kind of planning, we might be able to avoid guardianship. It's a very time-consuming and expensive process. And you may, even if you've done a declaration to say, I want this person to serve, if the court finds them for whatever reason to be an unsuitable choice, the court can override your decision on who you want to be your guardian. So estate planning can help avoid that. Another huge pitfall that we see all the time, and I'm sure Ellen sees this as well, do it yourself. Everybody's all about DIY. Let's go to Home Depot and do my own work. Let's get on Google and find a rocket lawyer to do my estate planning. Terrible idea. I mean, there are places for those kinds of things. I'm not going to say they're 100% across the board the devil, okay? But you are much better off not being your own surgeon and going to someone who knows what they're doing instead of someone who's trying to create a product that will work in all 50 states under all circumstances. So the DIY approach is not good because what ends up happening? You draft the documents, you have this false sense of security. Now when you really need the documents, they don't do what you want them to do. And there's a cost to it. If you do planning and you think you're fine and then you find out you're not, that can create a huge financial problem. So don't do it yourself. So what does that mean then? And this is not really intended to be a shameless plug, but if you find yourself in a situation where you're either in a proactive mode of wanting to do planning ahead of time, or God forbid you are in a crisis mode, my hope for you is that you have learned enough today to know I need to go see someone who specializes in this. I need to know that I am well in good hands and well taken care of so that I'm minimizing my time investment, minimizing my financial cost, and maximizing my chances of getting to the finish line that I want to be at. As you've heard, there's all kinds of different tools and techniques that we can use to get you to a certain point. We're not going to use the same tools for every job. We're going to use the tools that work. We like to provide a holistic solution. So yes, we can do estate planning documents, but we may also have some insight on facilities that may or may not be good in certain circumstances. We may be able to put you, if you've got a scenario where you've got a family law issue that comes up as part of the whole picture, we can help with that. Not because we do that work, but because we refer out to lawyers that we know and trust that do that work, so that we can hopefully provide you with a solution that we may play a part of, we may not play a part of, but hopefully we can get you to where you want to be because of the referral network that we have. So we got about 5 minutes left. If anybody has any questions, happy to answer them. And if not, thank you guys very much for being here this morning. We love doing these kinds of things to help people know what they don't know. So thank you for letting us be here.